G'day, this is Chris Savage from RL Ministries in Australia, welcoming you to this session of the Minor Prophets. I pray that it will be of benefit to you and help you in your Christian growth. Thank you for coming along. So we're into the last book of the Minor Prophets. We're into Malachi, and in this session, we're going to look at the introduction, and we should get down to chapter 2, verse 9. We'll give it a go. So here he is. I've just given you the outline. There's just a couple of short outlines. Nothing much. It's only 4 chapters. Now, in the introduction, we're looking at the burden of the word of Jehovah to Israel by Malachi. Now, Malachi is the prophet's name. It means my messenger or my angel. Hebrew word for messenger and angel is the same word. It's malach. But when you put an I on the end of it, it means my messenger or my angel. It becomes personalized. Now, within the book of Malachi, there are a number of individuals referred to as God's messengers. In fact, we have 4 altogether. First of all, we have Malachi himself, who is God's prophet. Who is also God's messenger. And that's the point of verse 1 that we're seeing here. The second messenger of God is the priest and the priesthood. And that comes out in chapter 2, verse 7. The third messenger mentioned will be the Messiah's forerunner in chapter 3, verse 1, and that is the one fulfilled by John the Baptist. And then fourthly, we have Messiah himself, who is considered God's messenger, coming to his temple in chapter 3, verse 1, the second part of verse 1. So we see that Malachi likes to play with the meaning of his own name, as we saw the prophets doing in previous prophets. And in this passage, what we're going to see is within the book, there are 4 different individuals referred to as his messengers. Now, regarding his family, we know absolutely nothing about his family. And no, it is not an Italian family. It's not Malachi, it's Malachi. So we know nothing. Some rabbis actually did believe that he was the same as Ezra the scribe, but there's actually, and that's taught by the Targums of Jonathan and by Rashi, Rabbi Rashi. However, there is no real evidence to make the 2 men the same person. Where was he? He is actually, to his place of his ministry, he's actually in Judah. And now Malachi is after the exile, after the return from Babylonian captivity. And more specifically, he actually prophesied in Jerusalem. Now, as far as the date is concerned, we're given several clues throughout the text. Now, first of all, it was during the Persian period. And why do we say that? Because in chapter 1, verse 8, Malachi uses a Persian term for governor. He uses the word pikah. It's not a Hebrew word, it's a Persian word. And the fact that he uses the Persian word for governor rather than the Hebrew word shows us it was during the Persian period, which gives it a 200-year period between 539 to 333 BC. We can narrow it down even further than that, though. From what he says in his own book, it's obvious that his book was written after the Second Temple was completed and had been functioning for quite a while. And the temple, we know, was completed in 515 BC. So the book was written sometime after 515 BC. So I think the best conclusion for the timing of this book is that it was written during Nehemiah's period. And since Nehemiah also came to Jerusalem twice, the similarity, we have a lot of similarity here with Nehemiah in the text, which we'll look at in the next slide. So the similarity demands that it be during Nehemiah's second stay in Jerusalem, which came sometime after the year 433 BC. So sometime after 433 and probably before the year 400, the book of Malachi was written. And basically, Malachi is to Nehemiah what Haggai and Zechariah were to Zerubbabel. Now remember, Zerubbabel was the governor before Nehemiah, and the prophets to him were Haggai and Zechariah. Then came Nehemiah as the governor, and Malachi is a prophet to him. Now here are some similarities here We have the faction of the priests in 1:6 through 2:9, which is also found in Nehemiah 13 verses 1 to 9. We also have that was the defection of the priests. We also have the neglect of tithes, which both of them spoke about, and that's mentioned in chapter 3 verse 8 to 12, and it's found in chapter 13 10 to 13 of Nehemiah. Another problem that they had was the intermarriage with pagan Gentiles, which in Malachi it's 2:11 to 16. Nehemiah, same thing again, 13:23 to 28. Another similarity is there was a widespread disregard for the observance of the Sabbath. In Malachi, it's chapter 2, verse 8 to 9, and again in chapter 4, verse 4. And in Nehemiah, we find it in 13:15 to 22. And lastly, we found there are similar social wrongs mentioned in Malachi 3:5 and found in Nehemiah 5:1 to 13. So they're obviously in the time frame because they're both talking about the same issues. Now, as far as the historical setting is concerned, we can say 7 things altogether. First of all, the prophecy comes during the period of Nehemiah's reforms. In fact, Malachi's prophecies may have stimulated the Reformation on the Nehemiah after he returned for a second stint as governor of Judah. In all likelihood, just as the prophecies of Haggai and Zechariah stirred up Zerubbabel to do his job, in the same way, Malachi's prophecies may have stimulated Nehemiah to get on with the task. So that's the first thing. Second thing is we had a ritual without reality in in the temple setting. The temple had been completed and the priesthood was back to performing the sacrificial system of the Mosaic law. And so there was a tremendous amount of ritual being carried out. But as we see Malachi will point out that there was no real heart or spirituality in it. There was no substance to their performance. It was simply a ritual. And third, as far as the racial situation was concerned, there was a spiritual problem seen in 2 ways. First of all, the priesthood had been corrupted, and second, the tithes were not being paid. Intermarriage and other facets blurred the people's responsibility in these matters. So fourth, their morality is called into question in various fronts. In Malachi, we will know from chapter 3, verse 5, that they are characterized by sorcery, adultery, perjury, fraud, and oppression. So there is a moral, if not a morality problem as a result of these things. In fact, chapter 3, verse 5 says, I'll come near to you to judgment. I'll be a swift witness against the sorcerers, the adulterers, false swearers, against those oppressed, the hireling and his wages, the widow and the fatherless, and that turn aside the sojourner from his right, and fear not me. So really, it's just a departure from the Mosaic law. The fifth area was some of the social problems mentioned in the text actually make up part of the background to the entire book. You can make 2 key comments here about their social situation. First of all, we had intermarriage with pagan Gentile women. Now, it was fine to marry a Gentile woman if she adopted the God of Israel as her God. And we see that with Ruth and Boaz, for instance. But what we have here is intermarriage with Gentiles who did not adopt the God of Israel. On the contrary, they were actually continuing with the worship of their foreign gods. Second, we also had the issue of divorce because the Jewish men were divorcing their Jewish wives. They began to dump their Jewish wives in favor of marrying pagan Gentile women. And that is the social atmosphere into which Malachi is now called to speak. And the sixth thing we see is that this period was the beginning of the movement towards the Talmud. At this point, the Talmudic period had more or less begun. And unfortunately, this would lead eventually to the corruption of the Mosaic law. And seventh, in the historical background, we see the early seeds of both Pharisaism and Sadduceeism in this book. There are going to be two problems here, which we will find, and that is formalism and scholasticism. So out of formalism will come the Pharisees, and out of scholasticism will come the Sadducees. And between the two of them, both Judaism and the Torah will now become badly corrupted, which we see, the seed of it in Jesus's day. Now, as a prophet, Malachi will make his own 5 key points in the book. First of all, what constitutes true ritualism? Now, remember, God is not against ritualism, but there is a true and a false ritualism. The first main point that Malachi will make concerns the true ritual, which is to the glory of God, and that needs to be coupled with faith. Second was the crime of divorce. This is a major point in Malachi. Third, we're going to see the coming of the 2 forerunners. There's one who comes before the first coming of Messiah, and another one who comes before the second coming, forerunner for the second coming. Now, fourth, we have the importance of the law of Moses in that day. Remember, Mosaic law was the overarching law, and in Malachi, we're still in the dispensation of the Mosaic law, when the law was still in effect, and that which God has ordained must be kept. And then we have the issue of, or the major point of, the faithful remnant. Now, the remnant motif was begun by Elijah the prophet and developed by Isaiah and others. It now reaches a further development with the prophet Malachi in his book. The theme of Malachi is the final call to Israel. He is the last of the prophets before the coming of the first forerunner, announcing the soon coming of the Messiah. So as the last of the prophets, he's dealing with the complaint of the people. They're asking, how can God love us when we suffer in this way? And we're going to be able to see in this book, as he points out, 3 things. He's going to point out that their present suffering was due to their own sins and disobedience. The fault is their own, it is not God's fault. Second, they should compare the difference between Israel and Edom, and then they would see that God has indeed loved them. He loved Jacob, but he hated Esau. Third, he points out that the day of Jehovah, or the day of the tribulation, is coming, when judgment is going to settle every injustice. Now, 3 passages of Malachi are quoted in the New Testament. Chapter 1, verses 2 to 3 is quoted by Romans 9:13. Chapter 3, verse 1 is quoted in Matthew 11:10, Mark 1:2, and Luke 1:76. And then in chapter 4, 5 to 6 of Malachi, that's quoted in Mark 9, verse 12, and Luke 1, verse 17. The burden of the word of Jehovah to Israel by Malachi. So looking at verse 1, specifically, it starts it with the words, the burden. Now, Malachi announces that this is the burden of the word of Jehovah. The Hebrew word masah means burden or oracle, and it's found 27 times in the Hebrew Bible, but it's in those passages which contain a threatening judgment. The only exception to this rule is found in Proverbs chapter 30, verse 1, and chapter 31, verse 1. The word is always connected with what they call a genitive objective, such as the burden of Babylon or the burden of Moab. The only exception is when an additional phrase, such as the word of the Lord, is mentioned, as we see here in Malachi chapter 1, verse 1, We're going to see it again in chapter 3, verse 1. Now, what's that all about? Well, it emphasizes the fact here that Malachi is dealing with a threat, and he's implying that God is to come soon to judge the world. That's what he's saying. We also saw this back in Zechariah 9:1 and Zechariah 12:1. So Malachi is to give out a prophetic oracle, which at the same time is a very heavy message to Israel. And it comes by Malachi, or as the Hebrew literally reads, by the hand of Malachi. And it goes to Israel, where the term Israel now refers to all 12 tribes, because it is after the return from Babylon, and so includes all 12 tribes of Israel. And we must remember here that Malachi will give us the last revelation for God, or from God, for 400 years. And he'll be talking about the coming of a forerunner, and the next prophet after Malachi will be John the Baptist. He is the forerunner. Now, one last thing by way of introduction is to deal with the method that Malachi uses when writing his book. It's a little bit unusual when compared with the other prophets. He uses what's called the dialectic method of approach employed by a man called Socrates, which contains 3 elements. First, he's going to make a simple statement of fact. And second, he's going to make an objection to the statement is then allowed to be made. And in Malachi, the objection begins with the word wherein. And so we read, wherein have we done this, or wherein have we done that, which we're going to see shortly. Third, we get to the answer. We get the answer to the objection. That's the Socratic dialectic method he'll use in his book. He'll make a statement. The statement will be objected to by the people. Then he'll give them the answer. And there are a total of 7 of these dialectics in this book. We're going to see one in chapter 1, verses 2 to 3, chapter 1, 6 to 7, chapter 2, verse 10 to 7, chapter 2, verse 10 to 16, and then we have chapter 2, verse 17. We have chapter 3, verse 7, chapter 3, verse 8, and chapter 3, verses 13 to 14. Now, we're going to divide up the book into 7 sections based upon these 7 dialectic approaches that the prophet now uses. Okay, we're into the book. Chapter 1, verses 2 to 5. We're going to see here God's love for Israel. I have loved, this is chapter 1, verse 2 to 5. I have loved you, said Jehovah, yet you say, wherein have you loved us? Was not Esau Jacob's brother, said Jehovah? Yet I loved Jacob, but Esau I hated, and made his mountains a desolation, and gave his heritage to the jackals of the wilderness. Whereas Edom said, we are beaten down, but we will return and build the waste places. Thus says Jehovah of hosts, they shall build, but I'll throw down. And men shall call them the border of wickedness, and the people against whom Jehovah has indignation forever. Your eyes shall see, and you shall say, Jehovah be magnified beyond the border of Israel. So here in chapter 1, verses 2 to 5, we have God's love for Israel, and using the Socratic method, we have the statement in the first part of verse 2. The statement of fact is, I have loved you, says Jehovah. Hebrew word for love, which is I have, is used 32 times of God's love, and 23 of those 32 times it is used of God's love for Israel. So most of the time the word love is used for God. It emphasizes God for Israel, and so God has affirmed his love for Israel many times. Some of the examples are in Deuteronomy 7, verse 7, and 10, verse 15, or was it 15? I think it's 15, and Hosea 11, verse 1. Just a couple of examples. In verse 2, we have the objection. Here's the wherein. Yet you say, wherein has thou loved us? Now, by this time, remember, the temple had been finished, and yet the golden age prophesied by both Haggai and Zechariah whose prophecies encouraged them to complete the temple, hadn't come, hadn't arrived as yet. So the people didn't understand that the millennial blessings would not immediately, or the messianic blessings would not immediately come after the rebuilding of the temple, which had been finished. They're expecting it then. What this objection shows is their insensibility to God's love and their own departure from God. The answer now comes in the second part of verse 2-5, where Malachi starts out with the example of Esau or Edom. Now remember, Esau was the father of the people who came to inhabit the country of Edom. The question is raised, was not Esau a brother to Jacob? That's the real meaning of the Hebrew text here, and it's pretty emphatic. Was not Esau a brother to Jacob? And the answer is, it would be yes. Yet I loved Jacob, but Esau I hated. So now these words have often been completely misunderstood by many people who don't understand the Jewish frame of reference here. The words loved and hated in Hebrew quite often, when they use like this, love and hate, is quite often simply either to choose or not to choose. To choose something is to love it. Not to choose something is to hate it. For example, back in Genesis 29, verse 30-33, where we have the account of Rachel and Leah, the statement is made that Jacob loved Rachel but hated Leah. Now, what that simply means in the context is that Leah was not preferred and was therefore not the one chosen by Jacob to be his wife. Rachel was preferred and therefore she was chosen. And this was a case where we had two women, one of whom Jacob wanted to marry. He wanted to marry Rachel, and so he loved her. He did not want to marry Leah, and so hated her. But again, it simply means that he chose Rachel and he did not choose Leah. In Deuteronomy 21, 15-17, we have another good example of this, where two wives are not equally loved. One was less loved than the other. So this love and hate is not psychological. It is not emotional. It is just a ranking of preference. It's just a setting of priorities. I love this one over that one. As I said to Lisa and stuff, if you go into a shoe store and you want to try on two pairs of shoes, one of which is black and the other one is brown, in the end you might choose the black ones, a black pair, but in doing that you will reject the brown pair. It doesn't mean that in Hebrew you'd say, well, you've loved the black pair of shoes, but the brown pair of shoes you've hated. That doesn't mean that you have an emotional anger or hate towards the brown pair. That's not what it means. It just means that you chose one over the other. That's all. Now, what we see here is the Hebrew here. It simply means, it indicates a choice. So in regard to Esau and Jacob, God says, it is Jacob I chose and not Esau. That's exactly what it means. In verse 3, as evidence, he points to the fact that the land of Edom had become a desolation. He says, I will make his mountains a desolation. Hebrew word for desolation here is shemama. It means desolate, without inhabitants. No one lives there. This will be a result of the habitual invasions that the land of Edom will suffer. And then he says, I gave his heritage to the jackals of the wilderness. The historical fulfillment of these prophecies came with the Babylonian destruction in 587 and 586 BC. And later on, when the Nabatean Arabs came and took over the country somewhere between 550 and 400 BC. In verse 4, we see the futility of Edom. Whereas Edom said, we're beaten down, but we will return and build the waste places. Edom thinks that he can succeed in total recovery. Now, this statement shows their confidence in their ability to restore all their losses. They believe they can restore everything to what it was prior to the devastation. But in response to that, God says, thus says Jehovah of hosts, they shall build, but I will throw down. So Edom will not be able to return to its former status and glory. Edom will not succeed in any attempt towards recovery. On the other hand, here's a contrast. God says Israel has recovered. Israel has returned from Babylon, while the Edomites have not recovered from their Babylonian destruction. As a result, Edom will be called two things. First of all, the border of wickedness. And second, the people against whom Jehovah has indignation forever. Now, similar expression was used by Jeremiah against Israel, but in his case, it was to last for only 70 years. But with Edom, God's indignation is not limited to just 70 years, it is forever. This means that Edom will not succeed in recovering the way Israel has. So God says to Israel through Malachi, "Wherein have I loved you? Just compare yourselves with your brother Esau and Edom. You've returned from Babylonian captivity. Your nation and your capital city has been rebuilt. Now, through Nehemiah, you have a strong wall. You've recovered and you've returned. But look at Esau and Edom. They have not recovered. And what is more, they never will. Rather, Edom will be called the border of wickedness." Now, in some of the earlier studies of the minor prophets, we noted that throughout the Messianic kingdom, the land of Edom will be a perpetual wasteland of burning pitch, one of two places on earth where the demons will be confined. And that is what's to happen to Edom, but it will not happen to Israel. Now, these statements will find their fulfillment in the Messianic kingdom. You can find it in Isaiah 34, 8-17, and Ezekiel 35, 1-15. In the future, Israel will respond in accordance with verse 5. "Your eyes shall see and you shall say, Jehovah be magnified," or glorified, that's what it means, "beyond the borders of Israel." Now, beyond the borders of Israel means to be among the Gentile peoples, the Gentile nations. And that is what Israel will ascribe to the Lord in a future day. "Let the Lord's name be magnified even among the Gentiles." So here then, in this first part of Malachi, we have seen him using this dialectic method. Now we're going to look at the unfaithfulness of the priests in chapter 1, verse 6 to chapter 2, verse 9. Again, we're going to see that Socratic dialectic method in verses 6-7. "A son honors his father and a servant his master. If then I am a father, where is mine honor? And if I'm a master, where is my fear? Says Jehovah of hosts unto you, O priests that despise my name. And you say, wherein have we despised your name? You offer polluted bread upon mine altar, and you say, wherein have we polluted you? In that you say the table of Jehovah is contemptible." So here we have the Socratic method, dialectic method used twice. The statement of fact is in the first part of verse 6. And the basic truth is, a son honoreth his father and a servant his master. That's a statement of fact. Now, the obligation to Israel is that if Jehovah is their father, where is his honor? If Jehovah is their master, where is his servants and service? Now, Israel is described in scripture as both as the son of God and the servant of God. Israel is a son of God according to Exodus chapter 4, verse 22, and Isaiah chapter 1, verse 2. Jeremiah 31, verse 19, Jeremiah 31, verse 9, and Hosea 11, verse 1. So, if Jehovah is their father and Israel is the son of God, where is their honor of him as their father? And the point is, they do not honor him. Now, according to Isaiah 41:8, Israel is also the servant of Jehovah. And according to Isaiah 1:3, God is also Israel's master. So he goes on to say, and if I am a master, where is my fear? Yet Israel does not fear Jehovah the way a servant should. So the people in general are guilty of not honoring God as father and fearing him as master. And this is especially true of the priesthood. who should have known better and should have led Israel in these things. They had not honored God either as their father or as their master. But even further than that, Malachi says they're guilty of profaning God's name. Says Jehovah of hosts unto you, O priests, that despise my name. That's the statement of fact. And at the end of verse 6, we have the objection. Wherein have we despised or profaned your name? And the answer in the first part of verse 7 is, you offer polluted bread upon my altar. The sacrifices are not inspected and are blemished. And the sacrifices were not brought coupled with faith. At the same time, this answer now presents another charge, another statement of fact in this Socratic method. Now, this leads to the second objection. And you say, wherein have we polluted thee? And the answer in the end of verse 7 is, in that you say the table of Jehovah is contemptible. Now, having stated these two statements, objections and answers of this Socratic method from chapter 1, verse 8 through chapter 2, 9, he now gives a lengthy elaboration on his charges in verses 6 to 7. The first key problem he mentions are bad offerings in verses 8 to 10. And when you offer the blind for sacrifice, it is no evil. And when you offer the lame and sick, it is no evil. Present it now unto thy governor. Will he be pleased with thee? Or will he accept thy person, saith Jehovah of hosts? So, as he now elaborates in those verses 6 to 7, in verses 8 to 10, he points out that they have been giving him bad offerings. Verse 8, he talks about the evil sacrifices. They claim that when they offer a blind for sacrifice, it is not evil. You can offer a blind lamb or a blind bullock, doesn't matter, it's not evil. Or when they offer the lame and the sick as a sacrifice, it is not evil. But in actual fact, it is evil. So he tells them, why don't you guys try to present these types of offerings to your governor, using the Persian word for governor here. And will he be pleased with these offerings? He certainly won't be. Will he accept your person? No way. So in other words, these guys have the nerve to give to God what they would not dare offer to the human Gentile governor. And this is a clear violation of the Mosaic law as found in Exodus 12 verse 5 and 29 verse 1. Also in Leviticus 22, 18 to 25, Numbers 6:14 and Numbers 19:2, Deuteronomy 15:21 and 17:1. Very clearly stated out there. Verse 9 says, and now I pray you, entreat the favor of God that he may be gracious unto us. This has been by your means. Will he accept any of your persons, says Jehovah of hosts? So in verse 9, he makes an appeal to the priests that they would do their work and appeal to God so that God's favor, so that God's grace would come. He says, now I pray you, entreat the favor of Jehovah, meaning seek his grace for the reason that he may be gracious unto us. In other words, if they would seek God's grace, God will give his grace to them. But did they do it? Then he says, this hath been by your means. So these false sacrifices were all perpetrated by the priesthood themselves, and that's why they were especially guilty. They of all know much, much better. So he says, will he accept any of your persons? God will not accept them any more than the governor will accept them. But if they seek him, then God will accept them. Now, because of that, in verse 10, there's a rejection of the type of offerings they're bringing in verse 8. So Malachi writes here, oh, that there were one among you that would shut the doors, that you might not kindle fire on mine altar in vain. I have no pleasure in you, saith Jehovah of hosts, neither will I accept an offering at your hand. So in verse 10, we have an appeal from God to shut the temple doors, closing off all access to the altar of sacrifice. Why? that you might not kindle fire on mine altar in vain. They may just as well do that for all the good they were doing. The temple doors might just as well be closed permanently, because all these sacrifices are vain sacrifices, because they are blemished, and obviously in this case not coupled with faith, and so these sacrifices are not acceptable to God. I have no pleasure in you, says Jehovah of hosts, neither will I accept an offering at your hand. So here is one area where the priests were profaning God's name and were not honoring him as father or master by offering bad offerings. The second thing he deals with the elaboration is in verses 11 to 14. They are guilty of profaning God's name. For from the rising of the sun even unto the going down of the same, my name shall be great among the Gentiles. And in every place incense shall be offered unto my name, and a pure offering. For my name shall be great among the Gentiles, says Jehovah of hosts. But you profane it, in that you say the table of Jehovah is polluted, and the fruit thereof, even its food, is contemptible. You say also, behold, what a weariness it is, and you have snuffed at it, says Jehovah of hosts, and you have brought that which was taken by violence, and the lame and the sick. Thus you bring the offering. Should I accept this at your hand, says Jehovah? But cursed be the deceiver who hath in his flock a male, and voweth, or takes a vow, and sacrifice unto the Lord a blemished thing. For I am a great king, says Jehovah of hosts, and my name is terrible among the Gentiles. So besides them offering bad offerings in verses 8 to 10, they're also guilty in verses 11 to 14 with profaning God's name. In verse 11, he spells out what the future is going to be like, and in that future time, the Gentiles will honor God's name, because he says here, for from the rising of the sun even unto going down of the same, my name shall be great among the Gentiles. Furthermore, we see that the Gentiles will bring offerings to God. And in every place incense shall be offered unto my name, and a pure offering, for my name shall be great among the Gentiles. So this, of course, is going to be in the millennial temple, and it will be in fulfillment of what was said earlier in chapter 1, verse 5, where we spoke about Jehovah being magnified beyond the borders of Israel. That's how the future is going to be. The problem, though, is at the present time, the Jews themselves and the Jewish priests especially are profaning God's name, according to verses 12 to 14. One way they profane God's name is in verse 12, and that is by calling the altar polluted and contemptible. He says, but you profane it. And that is in contrast to the Gentiles, he says. But you profane it, and while the Gentiles will in the future give pure offerings, at the present they're offering polluted sacrifices. Furthermore, they say that the table of Jehovah is polluted, and the fruit, even its food, is contemptible. This is what the priests are saying. And so by calling the altar polluted and the fruit contemptible, they're profaning God's name. A second way they're profaning God's name is in verse 13, in that they have become weary with the sacrifices. To them, he says, you say also, what a weariness it is. For then the sacrifices were not being offered as unto the Lord for the glory of God. Rather, for them it has become a bit of a drudgery, and they're bored with it. And so they're snuffing at it. They're lifting up their nose against it, saying, oh my gosh, when's this all going to be over? And he says, the priests, you have brought that which was taken by violence. So what he's saying here is that the offerings that they do offer are things that they have stolen. Not even their own. They stole the sacrifices. And they also offer that which is maimed or lame and that which is sick. And God's response is, should I accept these at your hand? And it's a rhetorical question. And the answer should be no, no way. So because they've profaned God's name by calling the altar polluted and contemptible and being weary with the sacrifices, in verse 14, the curse is going to come. He says, cursed be the deceiver And the curses are against those who offer blemished sacrifices, who has in his flock a male and vows, but these vows are false vows because the offerings are faulty, and they sacrifice unto the Lord a blemished thing. Here Malachi moved from speaking of sacrifices in general to discussing the payment of vows. Making a vow to the Lord was not mandatory, but if a person did, he was required to pay it according to Deuteronomy 23, verses 21 to 23. Deuteronomy 23, 21 to 23. Moses in Leviticus 22, 17 to 25 gave the priests specific instructions about the kinds of sacrifices acceptable for payments of vows. The vow to give an acceptable animal and then bring a blemished animal was wrong. Certainly no one would try to cheat a king or a governor for fear of being reprimanded and punished by that authority. And the reason the curse comes with these things is, first of all, God says, I am a great king. Therefore, God has a reputation to sustain. And that's a point which we'll see in the next slide. He made it in 1 Samuel and some more. So one reason the curse must come upon Israel is because God is a great king and his reputation must be maintained. But secondly, his name shall be terrible among the Gentiles. What does that mean? It means that it shall be honored and reverenced amongst the Gentiles. And if in the future God's name shall be great among the Gentiles, the Jews should honor that name right now. So God's reputation, we see, is a point made in 1 Samuel 12:12, Psalm 10:12, Psalm 10:16, 24:8, 84:3, 95:3, and Isaiah 33:22, and Isaiah 43:15. Some other verses regarding God being a great king and he who must retain his reputation, Isaiah 44:6, Jeremiah 8:19 and 10:10, and Zephaniah 3:15. Now, a third way that the unfaithfulness of the priest has been shown is in chapter 2, verse 1 to 9, in which he deals with the disobedience to the Mosaic law and the Mosaic covenant. He begins in the first 3 verses with a warning. And now, O you priests, this commandment is for you. If you will not hear, and if you will not lay it to heart to give glory unto my name, says Jehovah of hosts, then will I send the curse upon you, and I will curse your blessings. Yes, I have cursed them already because you do not lay it to heart. Behold, I will rebuke your seed and will spread dung upon your faces, even the dung of your feasts, and you shall be taken away with it. In verse 1, Malachi now clearly spells out that what he is about to say is particularly a message for the priests. And now, O you priests, this commandment is for you. In verse 2, he pronounces the curse. Then will I send the curse upon you, priests. If they fail to glorify God's name, then all the previous blessings he had given them since the temple had been completed would now be turned into curses. All blessings will cease if you will not hear and if you will not lay it to heart. Because of the lack of listening and obeying God's word, the curse would come. And it will come because they failed to glorify God's name, to give glory unto my name. All the blessings will cease to come. Yes, I have cursed them already. They have already experienced the curse, but if they don't respond, they'll experience the curse even further because they do not lay it to heart. This is almost an exact quotation of Deuteronomy 28, verse 20. Deuteronomy 28, verse 20 says this: Jehovah will send upon thee cursing, discomfiture, and rebuke in all that thou puttest thy hand on to do, until thou be destroyed, and until thou perish quickly because of the evil of thy doings, whereby you have forsaken me. In verse 3, he spells out what the results will be. Behold, I will rebuke your seed. Now here it's a verb, and in Deuteronomy 28:20, it's a noun. To rebuke the seed means to stop its growth, to slow the growth, means the vegetation growth will cease. I'm going to rebuke the seed. And I will spread dung upon your face, even the dung of your feast. He's going to take the dung of these bad offerings, these blemished offerings, and he's going to smear it on the faces of the priests, and they shall be taken away with it. Meaning they're going to be rejected, as in Deuteronomy 28:20, and they'll be separated and they'll be removed from the living God. God will not tolerate these kinds of actions further. And he very graphically depicts just how he's going to defile the priesthood and then take them away, remove them. In 4-9, he draws a contrast between Levi, one of the 12 sons of Jacob, from whom the Levitical tribe had descended. He's the founder of the tribe and the present priesthood. And you shall know that I have sent this commandment unto you, that my covenant may be with Levi, saith Jehovah of hosts. My covenant was with him of life and peace, and I gave them to him that he might fear, and he feared me, and stood in awe of my name. The law of truth was in his mouth, and unrighteousness was not found in his lips. He walked with me in peace and uprightness, and turned many away from iniquity. For the priest's lips should keep knowledge, and they should seek the law at his mouth, for he is the messenger of Jehovah of hosts. But you are turned aside out of the way. You have caused many to stumble in the law. You have corrupted the covenant of Levi, saith Jehovah of hosts. Therefore have I also made you contemptible and base before all the people, according as you have not kept my ways, but have had respect of persons in the law. So here in verses 4-7, he focuses on the covenant of Levi. And in verse 4, the covenant was made, and you shall know that I have sent this commandment unto you. And that's the commandment unto the priesthood, that is. That my covenant may be with Levi, says Jehovah of hosts. Now, Levi stands as the representative head of the Levitical priesthood, and there was a Levitical covenant made with the priesthood as mentioned in Exodus 32, 25-29, Numbers 8:5-19, 18-16, all the references are there on the slide. Jeremiah 33, 20-21. The point of these verses is that of all the tribes that God could have selected to enter into the priestly service, he chose only one of them, the tribe of Levi. So this covenant was made with Aaron, the descendant of Levi, who became the head of a new line of priests. This commandment was sent so that if it is obeyed, the Levitical priesthood will continue in blessing. In verse 5, he reminds them that first of all, Levi feared God's name. So he said, my covenant with Levi, my covenant was with him, was of life and of peace. Of life meaning survival, of peace meaning physical and spiritual peace, as well as economic welfare. And he says, I gave them to him that he might fear. So he gave them the covenant with its intended blessings so that they would fear his name. And the result was Levi feared my name. And he, Levi, stood in awe of me. Furthermore, not only did Levi fear God's name in verse 5, in verse 6, he did the work of righteousness. He was characterized by doing the work of righteousness. He says the law of truth was in his mouth. He was true and truthful. Secondly, unrighteousness was not found in his lips. He was one of pure lips. Thirdly, he walked with me in peace and uprightness. So Levi was characterized as walking with God. Now, this is a very significant statement here. What we see here, there's a progression here. We see that Levi, he feared God, he did righteousness, and he walked in peace and uprightness. Now, regarding walking with God, he walked me. If you keep in mind that there are only two other men in the Old Testament who were said to have walked with God. One was Enoch in Genesis 5, 22-24, and another one was Noah in Genesis 6, verse 9. These men walked with God, and Abraham was commanded to do so in Genesis 17:1, and probably did so. But the point is that That phrase is not used of Abraham. It is used only of Enoch, of Noah, and now of Levi. And so he turned away many from iniquity. This too was the work of Levi. In verse 7, he spells out the standard that was used. And the standard is the law. They must teach the law because the priest's lips should know knowledge or should keep knowledge. The word for law here is Torah. The priests were to teach the law. Deuteronomy 33:10 tells us that. Deuteronomy 33:10. It was a function of the priesthood to teach the content of the law. They should seek the law at his mouth. People should inquire as to the meaning of the scriptures from the priesthood. So the standard is the Mosaic law, which the priesthood was to know and to teach, and he was to be the messenger of God to the people. Now, besides Malachi being the messenger, the priest is also the messenger, in keeping with the meaning of Malachi's name. And this is the reason why the priesthood had to maintain the study of the teaching of the law. And the reason is that he is the messenger of Jehovah of hosts to the people of Israel. This was a task of the priest, according to Leviticus 10:11, Leviticus 10:11 and Jeremiah 2:8. Now, in this verse, we have the only time that a priest is called a messenger of Jehovah of hosts. Elsewhere, the word is used of the angel of Jehovah. It's used of a prophet only once in Haggai 1, verse 13. It's used here in Malachi only in the sense that it is Malachi's name, but not identifying him with the verbal form. Now, of course, there were not days when everyone could have their own Bibles. Scrolls were very few and far between. So it was part of the job assigned to the tribe of Levi to send their men out as messengers to teach the Mosaic law to the other 11 tribes. That's why on any map you will be looking at with the tribal divisions, you'll not find any part of the land given to the tribe of Levi. Rather, what you see is that every tribe or every other tribe had the responsibility of setting aside certain cities for members of the tribe of Levi to live in them. And from these cities, they were then to go out on their teaching missions. Aaron and his generation of the tribe of Levi did fulfill their task. Finally, in verses 8 to 9, he points out the failure of the current priests in contrast to Levi of old. He begins with a charge in verse 8 by saying, "But you," in contrast to Levi, "but you are doing certain things wrong." He charges them with wrongdoing in 3 counts. You are turned aside out of the way, which means that they have departed from the law of Moses. You have caused many to stumble in the law. As a result of departing from the law of Moses, the people are now stumbling in the law. And you have corrupted the covenant of Levi, the covenant that God made with Levi. So in verse 9 comes the punishment. Therefore have I also made you contemptible and base before all the people. As they have called the altar contemptible, now God has made them contemptible in response. And the priests were contemptible to the people for 2 reasons. Firstly, according as you have not kept my ways. So the first reason is disobedience to the law. And secondly, they have had respect of persons. They were partial to certain people. The law was to be applied equally. When they did apply the law, they had respect of persons. For under the law, the priests were given judicial functions, and by law, they had to be impartial, as brought out by Deuteronomy 17, 9 to 11, and Deuteronomy 19, verse 17. And so the priesthood is guilty of failure in these areas, and therefore he has emphasized the unfaithfulness of the priests. And this brings us to the end of our first session in Malachi. Study hard and grow strong. Thank you for coming along.